Hello, everyone. It's Bactrian, and today we're going to be talking about Greenland. And to be more specific, we're going to be talking about can or will the United States annex Greenland? It's been talked about a lot lately. In an NBC interview he had today, Trump did actually, he doubled down, as the article's saying here, on how he wants to take Greenland. He's been talking about this for years. He first brought up the idea in 2019 in his first presidency, and he said that we'll go as far as we have to go. Or sorry, this was not in his interview with NBC. This was talking to reporters in the Oval Office, but whatever. Same difference. He's openly saying that he wants to take over Greenland, right? J.D. Vance and his wife Usha Vance, they visited Greenland the other day. There were, the pictures of him going around in a coat with his wife, and they're visiting and talking about how, oh, Denmark's giving you guys a raw deal, and we could take over. So it's been talked about a lot. I mean, obviously, Trump has also talked about taking over Panama, taking over Canada, um, and this is obviously getting a lot of attention. But how real is this, right? How seriously should we take these threats, and how realistic of a prospect would this be? So, for starters, I mean, Greenland is, in talking about this, Greenland's not currently an independent country. It's a territory in Denmark, right? It's sort of it was formerly a colony without any sort of self-government. In the 70s was given home rule, and now is more and more autonomy, and is very likely to achieve independence in the next 10, 20 years. Maybe sooner, probably sooner. There's a good chance. Greenland is primarily Inuit people live in Greenland. It's about 50,000 people. And yeah, it's an extremely large island. It's about 2 million square kilometers, right? So it's a massive, massive place, and but fairly sparsely populated. But it's still part of Denmark for the time being. And what would an actual U.S. takeover look like? I mean, there's a couple different options for this. I mean, Trump has talked about the potential of using military force. We'll get to that later, but probably the most realistic prospect for annexing Greenland and making it part of the U.S. would be buying it. Right? It would be some kind of purchase analogous to the purchase of Alaska from Russia in the 19th century. Um, However, it's not the 19th century anymore. This would be much, much, much more controversial than it was then. I mean, for starters, and this is the first reason why I am going to argue it's not terribly likely the U.S. will be annexing Greenland, or be able to annex Greenland, is that Greenlanders don't want to join the U.S. Again, this poll, 85% don't want to join the U.S. That's not really a prospect that you can change. There's not really anything you can do to bring down public sentiment from that high of an amount. And why would there be, right? I mean, they want their own autonomy. It's a very different country, different people from Americans. They don't want to be Americans, right? They don't want to join. And so it's pretty hard to overcome that. I mean, that sort of makes it's a non-starter basically, because no local government is ever going to voluntarily agree to something that 85% of the population don't want. It's just never going to happen. Maybe the Danish government would in theory, but that would be extremely unpopular with the people in Greenland who actually live there. Um, and so you might say, okay, well, sure, but what if the Americans just want to do it anyway? Well, the problem with that is they kind of don't, right? I mean, this was a poll taken in January, but similar polls have found more or less the same thing. I just kind of like the graphic for it. For this is just for the concept of the U.S. seeking ownership of Greenland. Not even like talking about any of the specifics, none of the particularities of it, nothing like that. It finds that that idea has negative 18% approval with all U.S. adults. And yeah, negative 45% approval with Democrats, and only plus 19 support with Republicans. Um, Considering that, again, Greenland is a pretty it was the most realistic probably of the three stated ownership goals, although it's still very unrealistic. These are really bad numbers to start out with, just for even the concept of seeking acquisition of it. Not even talking about any of the specifics, and we'll get to the specifics in a second. Um, then if you actually ask people, okay, well, what about if the Americans were using military force to take over Greenland, right? Only 23% of people who are pro annexation are okay with using military force, right? So that means that in total, 6% of Americans say that they would like to use military force to take over, Greenland, or would be okay with that, right? And that's before anything would even happen, any potential occupation, potential resistance to that occupation from people who, actually live there, are capable of living in the country. I mean, it's pretty extreme weather. I kind of doubt that like the Americans are going to deploy like Arctic forces as an occupation force. It's absurd. It's absurd, right? Um, and so it's kind of a non-starter, right? Um, and then obviously would also be an appalling, incredibly controversial thing to do. People talk about the idea of, oh, well, if the Americans invaded, it would trigger Article 5 in NATO. I mean, technically, yes, I suppose. It's never actually been tested, I don't think. There's never been an instance where a NATO country has attacked another NATO country and they've tried to invoke Article 5. So who knows how that would actually play out. I strongly doubt that the Europeans would actually be willing to um, potentially push to like an actual shooting war with the Americans over Greenland. I don't think that would be the case. I think that what's much more likely to happen in that hypothetical, if Trump just really went for it and decided to attempt an invasion, is that it would sort of be like Crimea from 2014 on, where it's not recognized as part of the U.S. By anyone with any legitimacy. Um, but then that's just the idea of acquiring the territory, and that already sounds fanciful. But once they actually would have it, what are they going to do, right? I mean, you'll see that. What's of note is that when actually asked about this, U.S. lawmakers, like GOP lawmakers, are really skeptical of the idea. Like, yeah, Senator Tom Tillis, who, I mean, has voted for all of Trump's appointments. He's not like some. There's not really any of these people left, but he's not even some like, oh, a moderate quote unquote Republican or something. He's a mainline doctrinaire Trump Republican. He's like, I think it's impractical. Oh, the Greenland residents have stated their own objections, which is a very polite way of putting it. Um, and points out that, yeah, the U.S. already has military bases. So like, what's even the need to do this? Yeah, a senator from North Dakota says we could certainly make offers and gestures and see what's possible. I think that's all well and good. And blah, blah, blah. This seems like the kind of thing we can impose on somebody. So they're clearly like, don't do this. This is a stupid idea. No one would like this. It would be a total disaster. And part of why also that's the case is because, and this also is a problem for other ideas like getting some kind of voluntary annexation of Greenland, is what is Greenland's status then going to be if it were absorbed into the United States? Is it going to be a state? Is it really going to be a state? They're going to make it a state? I mean, for starters, it would be by far the least populated state in the country. So, like, if you lived in Greenland, your vote would be disproportionate, like insanely disproportionate for determining the presidency. It would entitle Greenland to a representative in the House of Representatives. It would entitle Greenland to 2 senators. Keep in mind the current GOP majority is 3 senators. And I mean, I strongly suggest that, in this hypothetical, the 2 Greenlandic senators would be pretty safe Democratic seats. I just, don't really see it going any other way, or maybe perhaps some sort of like local autonomous party that would be, particularly by American standards, pretty left of center. Um, I don't think Republicans would have any interest in that. I think that would just weaken their position domestically. Not to mention all the myriad other issues with integrating a new state. It would be very costly, all this other stuff. And for what benefit, right? I mean, unfortunately, the United States, due to agreements that Denmark has made with them, already has kind of a fairly free hand in Greenland, right? I mean, they've been able to do mineral extraction, military bases, all of these other things, and kind of use it as like, essentially an extension of the U.S. in all but name up until this point. And perhaps that might change because of how, hard he's pushed on this whole stupid annexation idea, right? But there would be nothing gained, and it instead would be a massive, boondoggle, right? It would just be extremely costly, controversial, and pointless. Right? It would be totally pointless. It would just serve these like aesthetic goals of like, oh, we're going to expand the country and take over new lands, right? It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy. Um, so, but there is another. There's a couple other options. I mean, one other thing, and it's worth keeping in mind that I think that in a situation where Greenland was like forcefully taken, this would be the most likely outcome, is that it would probably be made a status similar to Puerto Rico, where it's a territory. A territory is a polite way of saying colony. I mean, let's just be perfectly clear here. Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, these are places that are part of the United States. And, they're American citizens, etc. But they're not allowed to vote in U.S. elections. They can only vote in primaries. Um, they don't have representation in the Senate or the House of Representatives. They have self-rule, quote unquote, but in reality are forced to, capitulate to American economic demands and fiscal rules, particularly in the case of Puerto Rico. Um, they're treated abysmally, absolutely abysmally. And I, it would not be a good deal for Greenland. And people in Greenland are aware of this. They would not be in favor of this under any circumstance. Um, and so yeah, that's one potential option that again just has the issue of no one would be on board with it there. Like every single one of these places, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, were essentially taken in either colonial deals, like in the Virgin Islands case, which was bought from Denmark, or were annexed in colonial wars, like Puerto Rico, Guam, etc., which were, at least in Puerto Rico's and Guam's case, they were annexed from Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1902. These places didn't voluntarily join, and they never would, right? It would have to be forced, and that would just be deeply, deeply controversial diplomatically and politically, that it would essentially be untenable. It would have to be, in order for it to be possible, you would have to have like a full-throated public effort to kind of like rally at least just Republicans in the U.S. on board with this, and that's a years-long propaganda effort. One that this current kind of half-assed version of it, where like, oh, Vance is going to go there and say, well, Denmark's been pretty mean to Greenland, which is actually true, but the Americans would be just as bad, if not worse. It's not going to shift anyone's opinion, right? It's not gonna actually do that, even domestically in the U.S. No one's buying into this who's not already aboard with the idea. So I think all of these outcomes are more or less off the table. I don't think it's realistic to imagine, just because of the cost benefit, right? Even if Trump might want it to be the case, any sort of actual military or economic acquisition really getting off the ground or getting going, right? Or if it did, it would be such a disaster that they would have to back off, I think, right? In all likelihood. But there is one outcome that I could see happening, and that would basically be annexation. And that is a compact of free association, right? So, a compact of free association is a sort of an agreement where the country is independent, but they pretty much in every meaningful way. So like defense, social services, stuff like funding for various programs, all this other stuff. They are deeply, deeply dependent on in the United States, because it's kind of an American term, right? They're essentially a client state, or like a trust, right? And they pretty much only really get to be independent insofar as they have like their own UN membership, and like a little bit of autonomy or leeway in terms of foreign affairs, right? But like otherwise, like yeah, the U.S. Post Service, the FAA, the FCC, all like service these areas, and they're covered by the U.S. military and all this other stuff, right? They're essentially part of the U.S., but they're given very, very little, no representation. They have their own nominal self-governments, and they're kind of like, they're client states. They're kind of like an extension of the U.S. And why do I say that this is kind of possible? Well, because if you had a situation where, say, Greenland got independence, but the European states aren't really willing to kind of come to some sort of agreement like this, or for whatever reason, Greenland is able to be convinced that they might get a kind of better deal from the Americans, this is the only version of any kind of like something close to annexation that I could really see happening, right? Where they sort of agree to hand over these parts of autonomy in exchange for keeping their independence on a kind of nominal rate, right? And that's like the only version of this that I could actually see happening realistically. And even this, I want to be clear, I think is very, very unlikely. Like I don't think that I'd give this maybe like a 5-10% chance of actually happening by the end of like a Trump term. That's how unlikely I think this is. Now, do I think that there might be a serious attempt to annex Greenland, perhaps even through military force? I think there could be an attempt. I wouldn't put it past Trump, and I wouldn't put it past the Republicans, but it's very important to remember these things are way easier to say than to do, right? And I don't want to diminish the intent here. I don't want to diminish how harmful it is, obviously. But it's just, if we take a breath here and we really think about what this would look like in reality, I think it's way too controversial, way too little of a base of support. Basically, just kind of Trump and his coterie, his little guys, right, are the only people who are willing to go out and support this. And the fact that these domestic support numbers are this low when nothing has happened, when you don't even have any of the negative consequences that would come from this, and this is also at the peak of Trump's popularity in January of this year, like, it's downhill from here, right? It's only going to get harder and harder to do this. And then once you actually have any blowback or consequences from it, it's going to get even harder. I just think it makes it untenable, right? Perhaps in the longer term, that could change. I intend to make other videos about, for example, the long-term prospect of what Trump's rhetoric about Canada or Trump's rhetoric about Panama, because I think those are kind of, they're all distinct scenarios. But at least in the very near term, for the stuff that Trump is talking about some big purchase of Greenland or something, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where he could actually pull that off. And he might fixate on it, he might really attempt to do it, but I don't think he's going to be able to. And I don't think he's going to be able to get very far with it even. And maybe longer term, if Greenland achieves independence at some point in the next 10-20 years, you could see an arrangement like a Compact of Free Association reached, although actually his recent actions make this a lot less likely, because he might have terminally alienated kind of any local government in Greenland and the local population. But that about wraps it up, I think. I think that's summarizes my position on that, and I hope that people learn something from that, because I think that while the coverage of this has been, I understand why it's obviously getting the kind of the way it has, like it is very shocking to hear the U.S. president, talking like this and talking about how he just wants to add places on the map. Like that hasn't really happened at any point recently. I think that just because it's so out of the norm, people do they don't really have realistic expectations regarding it, right? And so I think it's just important to take a bigger look there at the bigger picture and how possible this really is. So I mean, if you enjoyed that, like and subscribe. I'm Bactrian. Like and subscribe. All the YouTube stuff. I'm gonna be making editor videos about politics. I primarily talk about like Canadian politics, but we're gonna make other stuff like this, for example, which I think is also completely relevant to Canada. So yeah, if you enjoyed that, thank you and have a good day. Bye.